For decades, the world has seen Ice Cube as the ultimate symbol of untouchable strength, the fierce architect of gangster rap who conquered Hollywood without ever compromising his soul. But behind the legendary scowl and blockbuster franchises lies a deeply shattered man who has been fighting a losing battle against profound personal loss. From a horrific childhood murder that permanently broke his family, to watching his closest brothers in the industry die before they could make amends, Cube's journey is paved with agonizing grief. Now, at 57, after sacrificing millions and being quietly exiled by the very industry he helped build, a tragic truth has finally come to light. Long before he was immortalized as the architect of gangster rap, before the legendary scowl became a pop culture staple, and decades before he was a billionaire box office titan, Ice Cube was just O'Shea Jackson. He was a quiet, observant kid navigating the treacherous streets of South Central Los Angeles. Today, the world sees him as an indestructible force of nature, a man made of pure defiance. But the truth about how that impenetrable armor was forged is rooted in a childhood tragedy so senseless, so deeply traumatic, that it forever altered the trajectory of his life. When O'Shea was just 12 years old, his world was anchored by his family. In a neighborhood where survival was never guaranteed, the Jackson home was supposed to be a sanctuary. But the violence of the streets doesn't always knock on the front door. Sometimes, it comes from the people you are supposed to trust the most. In 1981, a devastating phone call shattered the peace of the Jackson household. O'Shea's older half-sister, Beverly, had been violently murdered in a horrific murder-suicide at the hands of her own husband. She was just 22 years old, and her life was extinguished just a few blocks away from where O'Shea slept, turning his immediate world into an unimaginable nightmare. Imagine being 12 years old, a time when your biggest worries should be schoolyard crushes or riding bikes, and suddenly being forced to process the brutal execution of your own flesh and blood. Beverly wasn't just a sibling. She was a vibrant, loving presence in O'Shea's life. Her death wasn't some stylized Hollywood movie script. It was real blood on the pavement. It was yellow police tape, flashing sirens, and the agonizing, guttural wails of a grieving mother echoing through the halls of their home. For young O'Shea, innocence wasn't just lost. It was violently assassinated. Psychologists often say that when a child experiences a trauma of that magnitude, they have two choices. Let it consume them entirely, or build a fortress around their heart so massive that nothing can ever hurt them again. O'Shea chose the fortress. The bright-eyed kid from South Central slowly began to disappear behind a cold, unyielding exterior. That world-famous Ice Cube scowl you see today? The intimidating glare that made him a rap god and a movie star? It was never a marketing gimmick. It was a deeply ingrained trauma response. It was the face of a grieving young boy desperately trying to convince the world, and himself, that he could no longer be broken. Unable to afford therapy and surrounded by an environment where vulnerability was viewed as a fatal weakness, O'Shea took his unspeakable grief and funneled it into the only outlet he had, a spiral-bound notebook. He began writing poetry, which quickly mutated into fierce, razor-sharp rap lyrics. He documented the brutality of his surroundings, the pain in his household, and the profound anger simmering just beneath his skin. Music became his salvation, a way to resurrect the voice that the tragedy had stolen from him. As his lyrical skills sharpened, O'Shea stepped out of the shadow of his grief and into the local hip-hop scene. He was looking for more than just a record deal. Subconsciously, he was searching for a new family. He desperately wanted a brotherhood that could fill the gaping void left by his sister's violent departure. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed like he had found exactly that. He joined forces with a group of local visionaries, stepping into the studio with men he firmly believed would be his lifelong brothers, protectors, and loyal comrades. He poured his bleeding heart into a collective that would soon be known globally as N.W.A. Finally, O'Shea felt safe. Finally, he felt like he belonged to a brotherhood that was completely untouchable. But the harsh reality of the music industry was about to teach him another agonizing lesson. Just as he was lowering his heavy emotional defenses and trusting these men with his life and his art, a sinister and calculated betrayal was quietly brewing in the shadows of the recording booth. A devastating betrayal that would strip him of everything he had just built, and push him back into the lonely darkness. Stepping into the vocal booth with N.W.A. was supposed to be Ice Cube's salvation. After the devastating loss of his sister, the raw, unfiltered camaraderie of Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, MC Run, and DJ Yella felt like a life raft in an ocean of grief. Cube wasn't just a member of this collective. He was its undeniable lyrical heartbeat. He was the architect of their aggression, the primary pen behind the monumental Straight Outta Compton album. He wrote not only his own legendary verses but also crafted the iconic rhymes that made Eazy-E a superstar. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the deafening roar of sold-out arenas and the adrenaline of terrifying the mainstream media masked the agonizing pain of his past. He finally had his brotherhood. They were young, fearless, and taking on the entire world together. But fame is often a deeply deceptive mirror, and the reflection looking back at Cube was starting to crack. While N.W.A. was rapidly becoming the most dangerous and profitable group on the planet, terrifying the FBI and shifting millions of records, the reality behind closed doors was horrifyingly bleak. Cube was the intellectual engine of a multimillion-dollar cultural revolution, yet his bank account told a completely different story. The poison seeping into the group's foundation came in the form of seasoned music executive Jerry Heller. To the young men of Compton, the music industry was a foreign landscape, and the contracts pushed in front of them were a complex maze of legal jargon designed specifically to exploit their inexperience. As the tours wrapped up and the massive album revenues rolled in, Cube started asking the difficult questions that no one else wanted to ask. He realized that the staggering wealth they were generating wasn't being distributed among the creators. Instead, the lion's share was funneling straight up to Heller and Eazy-E, who had formed a tight, impenetrable alliance. When Cube finally cornered his brothers for answers, the response was a knife to the chest. He looked Eazy-E directly in the eyes, the man he had trusted unconditionally, the man whose rap career he had essentially birthed by writing Boys in the Hood, expecting absolute loyalty. Instead, he found cold, corporate indifference. Eazy sided with Heller. For Cube, this was never just about the money. It was a profound emotional violation. This was the surrogate family he had chosen to heal the wounds of his shattered childhood, and they were actively robbing him blind while demanding his unquestioning obedience. When the time came to solidify their commitment, Heller slid a heavily drafted contract across the table. It was an insulting agreement that amounted to pennies on the dollar, a document that would require Cube to legally sign away his creative soul and his financial future. Everyone expected the kid from South Central to just shut up, take the scraps, and be grateful he was famous. They completely underestimated the impenetrable armor O'Shea Jackson had built. Refusing to be a victim ever again, Cube made a deeply agonizing decision. He threw the contract back, turned around, and walked away from the biggest rap group in the world. At just 20 years old, he was making a devastatingly lonely exit. He left the cultural phenomenon he built from scratch, stepping out into the cold reality of the industry with almost zero money to his name. The media, the executives, and even his former friends immediately wrote him off, convinced he had just committed career suicide. They believed without the massive machine of N.W.A. behind him, Ice Cube would quickly fade into obscurity, becoming an impoverished footnote in hip-hop history. But they were dead wrong. Cube wasn't retreating to lick his wounds. He was quietly sharpening his knives. Forced into isolation and fueled by a sense of betrayal so deep it burned, he began plotting a solo comeback that would shake the industry to its core. The world had no idea the sheer magnitude of the venom he was about to unleash. He was preparing to declare all-out war on the very empire he helped construct, but as he loaded his lyrical weapons, he had no idea that his ruthless quest for vengeance would soon collide with a devastating tragedy that he could never, ever undo. Walking away from N.W.A., Ice Cube didn't just survive. He detonated the entire landscape of hip-hop. With the release of his solo albums, he proved his genius was never dependent on Jerry Heller's backing. And when the remaining members of N.W.A. foolishly decided to take shots at him on their records, Cube responded with no Vaseline. To this day, it remains the most ruthless, surgical, and devastating diss track ever recorded. He dismantled his former group and their manager, line by brutal line. The public ate it up. The media crowned him the undisputed victor of the most vicious feud in music history. He was on top of the world, a solo superstar who had successfully executed a flawless revenge mission against the men who wronged him. But while the fans cheered and the record sales skyrocketed, a very different reality was playing out behind closed doors. The public saw a triumphant, untouchable rap god holding the severed head of his former crew. But what they didn't see was how deeply this civil war was tearing O'Shea Jackson apart. Remember, these weren't just random industry rivals. These were his brothers. They were the men who had pulled him out of the darkness after his sister's murder. Every time he performed that lethal diss track, every time the crowd roared at the insults directed at Eazy-E, a piece of Cube's heart broke a little more. The venom he had spit was a defense mechanism, a roar of pain from a deeply wounded man who simply wanted his family to treat him fairly. As the years rolled on, the blinding rage that fueled his exit began to cool. The petty squabbles over money and contracts started to feel remarkably trivial when compared to the profound bond they had once shared. Deep down, Cube missed his friend, and miraculously, the universe seemed to offer them a second chance. In early 1995, Cube and Eazy crossed paths at a club in Los Angeles. Instead of the explosive confrontation everyone expected, the two men simply talked. The ice finally broke. They smiled, they reminisced, and they quietly agreed that it was time to put the past behind them. There were whispers of a reunion, a chance to finally heal the fracture and get back in the studio together as grown men. Cube went home that night feeling a massive weight lift off his chest. The brotherhood was finally going to be restored. But tragedy, as Ice Cube knew all too well, rarely knocks before it enters. Just weeks after that hopeful conversation, the hip-hop world was brought to a dead, terrifying halt. Eazy-E was hospitalized with what he thought was asthma, only to be diagnosed with advanced stage AIDS. The decline was unimaginably rapid. Before Cube could fully process the news, before he could get to the hospital, sit by his brother's bed, and truly bury the hatchet with the deep, meaningful closure they both deserved, Eric Eazy-E Wright passed away on March 26, 1995. He was just 31 years old. The news absolutely shattered Cube. The devastation of his sister's murder came rushing back, compounding with this new, unbearable grief. The timing was a cruel, sickening joke. He had spent years publicly warring with a man he secretly loved, only for time to run out the very second he was ready to make peace. The guilt of that unresolved tension, the haunting realization that their final years were wasted on ego and bad contracts, became a heavy, suffocating ghost that would follow Cube for the rest of his life. Surrounded by the ghosts of his past and deeply disgusted by the toxic, literal life and death stakes of the music industry, Cube felt an overwhelming urge to escape. He could no longer bear the bloody battleground of gangster rap. Desperate to reinvent himself and find a creative outlet that didn't end in mourning, he made a radical, unexpected pivot. He set his sights on the dazzling, multi-billion-dollar empire of Hollywood, believing he could trade the gritty streets of the music business for the polished safety of the silver screen. But as he traded his microphone for a script, Ice Cube had absolutely no idea that the glittering Hollywood hills were hiding an entirely different breed of monsters. And he was walking straight into a corporate trap that would prove far more sinister than anything he left behind in Compton. Desperate to distance himself from the body count and unrelenting trauma of his music origins, Ice Cube sought sanctuary in the glittering machinery of Hollywood. He had already proven he could act with a powerhouse debut in Boys and the Hood, but simply being a hired gun on a movie set wasn't enough. Cube wanted to control his own narrative. He wanted to prove that the brilliant mind that crafted the most dangerous rap lyrics in history could also write, produce, and direct cinematic gold. So, he took a massive financial gamble, putting up his own money and writing a script about a regular day in his neighborhood. That script became Friday. Made on a shoestring budget of roughly $3.5 million, Friday was an absolute cultural earthquake. It exploded at the box office, spawning sequels, launching the careers of massive stars like Chris Tucker, and proving unequivocally that Cube was a creative visionary with an incredible pulse on what audiences wanted. He didn't just cross over into Hollywood. He kicked the door off the hinges. He quickly became a one-man studio, creating beloved franchises like Barbershop and Are We There Yet? His movies were grossing hundreds of millions of dollars, propping up studio bottom lines, and establishing him as one of the most reliable and bankable stars in the industry. To the outside world, Ice Cube had achieved the ultimate American dream. He had successfully escaped the tragic violence of his youth and the toxic betrayal of the music business, transforming himself into a wealthy, untouchable Hollywood mogul. He looked completely at peace. But the flashing cameras on the red carpets were hiding a dark, agonizing truth. Behind the scenes, Cube was locked in a humiliating, deeply frustrating battle with the very executives who were getting obscenely rich off his ideas. Hollywood, he quickly learned, was just the music industry in a more expensive suit. The same exploitation he suffered at the hands of Jerry Heller was happening all over again. Only this time the contracts were drafted in massive high-rise offices in Century City. Despite generating billions for major studios like New Line Cinema and Warner Brothers, Cube was constantly treated like a second-class citizen. He was fighting tooth and nail for adequate budgets to shoot his films. He was watching studio executives brutally underpay his actors, creating intense friction and forcing him to watch brilliant talents walk away from his projects because the studios outright refused to cut fair checks. He was the creator, the writer, the producer, and the star, yet the studios relentlessly held his intellectual property hostage. They refused to greenlight his scripts unless he bent to their exact, watered-down corporate mandates. The illusion of Hollywood safety was shattering. Cube realized that despite his massive success, the old guard executives never truly viewed him as a peer. They viewed him as a highly profitable commodity that needed to be tightly controlled and heavily restricted. The stress of constantly fighting for basic respect in the boardroom was exhausting, but it was a burden he was willing to carry if it meant protecting the art he created. He was a survivor. He could handle the corporate vampires. However, while he was busy fighting the studio bosses to keep his cinematic empire intact, a much darker shadow was quietly slipping onto his movie sets. As he geared up to fight for the future of his most beloved creation, the Friday franchise, an eerie, tragic pattern began to emerge. The very movies he had created to escape the grief and death of his past were suddenly becoming ground zero for a terrifying new wave of loss. Fans couldn't help but notice the dark cloud gathering over his work, leaving everyone to whisper the same chilling question. Was Ice Cube's greatest Hollywood triumph actually cursed? While Ice Cube was locked in exhausting boardroom battles to secure the rights to his own creations, a far more devastating reality was unfolding outside the executive suites. The Friday franchise wasn't just a series of hit movies to Cube. It was a deeply personal sanctuary. It was a fictional universe he built to celebrate the humor, resilience, and humanity of his neighborhood. A direct counter-narrative to the trauma and tragedy that had defined his early life. The actors he cast weren't just colleagues. They became an extended, vibrant on-screen family. But as the years passed and Cube desperately tried to get the studios to greenlight the highly anticipated final installment, last Friday, the cruel hand of tragedy struck again, and again, and again. It was as if a dark, unshakable curse had attached itself to the very franchise he had created to escape his grief. First, the world lost Bernie Mac, whose hilarious, brief appearance as Pastor Clever in the original film was a masterclass in comedic timing. Then came the tragic passing of Michael Clark Duncan, the gentle giant whose imposing presence anchored the Friday after next. The hits kept coming with agonizing frequency. Tiny Zeus Lister, who immortalized the terrifying but beloved neighborhood bully Debo, passed away unexpectedly. John Witherspoon, the legendary comedian who played Cube's hilariously grumpy father, Pops, died suddenly, leaving a gaping, irreplaceable hole in the heart of the franchise. And then, the heartbreaking loss of Anthony Johnson, the brilliant actor who brought the iconic, constantly stumbling easel to life. Watching his on-screen family be decimated by time and tragedy was profoundly agonizing for Cube. Every time he opened his phone to read another headline about a Friday cast member passing away, it ripped open the unhealed wounds of his past. The trauma of his sister's murder, the sudden, unresolved death of Eazy-E. It all came flooding back. He was once again the helpless survivor, standing over the graves of the people he loved, entirely unable to stop the bleeding. What made this grief even more unbearable was the bitter realization that he had spent the last decade practically begging the studio to let them make one final Friday movie while the cast was still alive. He had handed them finished scripts, practically pleading with them to understand the urgency. But the studio executives, completely disconnected from the cultural importance of the film and entirely devoid of empathy, dragged their feet. They gave him endless corporate notes, stalled the budgets, and tied the property up in legal red tape. By the time the studio even entertained the idea of moving forward, the heart and soul of the franchise were literally buried in the ground. Cube was left holding the shattered pieces of his beloved property, fighting for the intellectual rights to a movie he wasn't even sure he could emotionally bear to make anymore. The sheer disrespect of the studio's stalling tactics lit a renewed fire of defiance in O'Shea Jackson. He realized that playing by Hollywood's polite rules had cost him dearly. It was time to stop asking for permission. He began to voice his frustrations publicly, calling out the systemic greed and lack of respect within the major studios. He refused to smile for the cameras while executives handcuffed his creativity and profited off his pain. But Hollywood is a small, incredibly vindictive town, and the old guard does not take kindly to being challenged by a black creator who refuses to stay in his assigned lane. As Cube's demands for ownership and respect grew louder, a chilling, invisible wall began to form around him. The scripts that used to get greenlit overnight suddenly hit brick walls. The massive, lucrative deals he was accustomed to started vanishing into thin air. Without a single public announcement, a vicious and highly effective blackballing campaign had silently begun, setting the stage for a brutal industry exile that would force Cube to question everything he had spent 30 years building. Ice Cube had always operated on his own terms, but challenging the deep-rooted power structures of Hollywood requires a level of insulation that even a billionaire box office titan doesn't truly possess. When Cube stopped playing the quiet, compliant producer and started publicly demanding ownership of his intellectual property, specifically fighting New Line Cinema and Warner Brothers for control of the Friday franchise, the temperature in the room drastically changed. The Hollywood elite, accustomed to creators who eventually bow to corporate pressure, realized that O'Shea Jackson was never going to bend the knee. And so, the invisible machine began to work against him. It wasn't a loud, public firing. Hollywood rarely operates with that kind of transparency. Instead, it was a slow, suffocating freeze-out. Projects that Cube had in development suddenly found themselves trapped in turnaround or endless script revisions. High-profile meetings with studio heads that used to be a formality were suddenly being rescheduled or canceled altogether. The lucrative, multi-picture deals that had been his safety net for 2 decades quietly dried up. Cube found himself painted with the oldest, most insidious brush the industry uses against strong-willed black creators. He was labeled difficult to work with. It is a calculated, career-killing phrase used to justify cutting off a creator's resources. The very defiance and unapologetic authenticity that made him a global icon were now being weaponized against him by executives who felt threatened by his demand for equity. But the friction wasn't just about movie rights. As the global political climate became intensely polarized over the last few years, Cube refused to align himself blindly with any traditional political establishment. He drafted his contract with Black America, aiming to force politicians to address systemic economic issues, and he was willing to speak to anyone, regardless of party affiliation, who would actually listen. This pragmatic approach infuriated the mainstream media and deeply unsettled the heavily partisan Hollywood ecosystem. Rather than engage with his ideas, the industry apparatus moved to further ostracize him. He was unfairly smeared, aggressively criticized by former peers, and alienated by the very cultural institutions he had helped build. Stripped of his major studio backing and watching his once unshakable industry alliances crumble, Cube was experiencing a deeply isolating exile. The massive Hollywood empire he had built as a refuge from his traumatic past was now actively rejecting him. He was back to being that fiercely independent, lonely figure he was when he walked away from N.W.A, only this time the stakes were astronomical and the opponents were multi-billion-dollar conglomerates. Just as the walls seemed to be closing in, a major studio threw what looked like a massive lifeline. They offered Cube the starring role in a highly anticipated comedy film. It was a massive, glossy production that would firmly re-establish him at the top of the Hollywood A-list, effectively ending his quiet blackballing. The payday attached to the role was staggering. It was the kind of money that could secure his independent production company for years and silence all the doubters who claimed his career was fading. But, as always in Hollywood, there was a catch. This wasn't just a simple acting gig. Attached to the massive contract was a rigid, uncompromising corporate mandate that required Cube to make a deeply personal medical decision that fundamentally violated his personal beliefs. The studio drew a hard line in the sand. Comply with our exact terms, or lose the movie, the money, and potentially your last foothold in mainstream Hollywood. Faced with an ultimatum designed to break his legendary resolve, Ice Cube stood at the precipice of the most agonizing, high-stakes decision of his professional life. A decision that would result in a multi-million-dollar sacrifice and a heartbreaking realization about the true cost of his freedom. The offer on the table was a staggering $9 million. For a few months of work on the Sony comedy Oh Hell No, Ice Cube was guaranteed a payday that most actors never see in a lifetime. It was the perfect vehicle to catapult him back into the mainstream spotlight and effectively crush the quiet narrative that he had been pushed out of Hollywood. But the massive check came with a non-negotiable string attached. Sony mandated that all cast and crew must receive the COVID-19 vaccine to participate in the production. For Cube, this was never about taking a loud, aggressive political stance or joining a fringe movement. It was fundamentally about bodily autonomy. It was about his deeply ingrained, non-negotiable refusal to be strong-armed by a corporate entity into making a personal health decision. The studio executives assumed that when push came to shove, the kid from South Central would look at the $9 million and quietly comply. They believed that everyone in Hollywood has a price. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. O'Shea Jackson was forged by unspeakable childhood trauma. He had walked away from millions when Jerry Heller tried to control him. He had watched his closest brothers die because of the toxic nature of the industry. His entire life was a testament to the belief that your integrity is the only thing you truly own. Cube didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He looked at the $9 million, turned his back, and walked away. By refusing the mandate, Cube effectively sealed his own exile. He lost the role, he lost the money, and he cemented his status as a permanent outsider in the modern Hollywood system. At 57 years old, after generating billions of dollars in revenue and creating some of the most beloved cultural touchstones of the last 3 decades, Ice Cube found himself largely erased from the very tables he helped build. He had chosen his freedom over their money, but that choice came with a profound, isolating silence. Looking back at the sprawling, tumultuous landscape of his life, the tragedy of Ice Cube is not just the trauma he endured, but the relentless consistency of his sacrifices. He lost his sister to senseless violence, forcing him to build an emotional fortress. He lost his N.W.A. brotherhood to greed, forcing him into a lonely solo career. He lost Eazy-E to illness just before they could heal their wounds. He watched his beloved Friday family die off while executives played games with his art. And finally, he sacrificed millions and his mainstream Hollywood standing to maintain his personal sovereignty. He is a man who has conquered every arena he entered, yet at every single pinnacle, he has been forced to endure agonizing loss. He built empires, only to realize that true freedom meant being willing to watch those empires burn rather than surrender his soul to the highest bidder. But even for a man made of pure defiance, the weight of a lifetime spent fighting these lonely battles eventually takes a devastating toll. At the very end of this journey, we will uncover the heartbreaking private confession Ice Cube recently made about the true cost of his uncompromising nature. When you hear the exact reason he believes he has been systematically erased from the modern Hollywood table, and the one deeply personal regret he carries about the massive empire he left behind, your entire perspective on his legendary career will change forever.